Hello, and welcome to our next episode of Roots to Leaves. I'm Reverend Jude Geiger, Minister for Community Engagement here at Community Church in New York City, and I'm joined with my co-host, Brother Zachary, our chaplain for pastoral care, and we're closing out our season on the shared values of Unitarian Universalism: justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity, all centered in love. This week, as we're recording, is about a week out from when the 47th president will make history and be the first convicted and sentenced felon to take office. And we're going to wonder today about how, in this time and place, how do we ground ourselves in our shared values as individuals and as Unitarian Universalists? And Brother Zachary, who serves a UU church, will give his lens to this discussion, so it's not all just us thinking about ourselves all the time. Brother Zachary, I want to start with love. We keep saying we're centered in love with these values, and I know what that means for me, and you know what that means for you. And we're doing this out of New York City, which is sometimes cranky, sometimes short, usually helpful to people in need, despite popular sentiment, and often a little snarky. At least I'm a little snarky. I don't know about you.
Oh, I'm never snarky.
No, you're never snarky. And so love often in UU spaces, before the pandemic, we'll say, love often had some eye rolls in our pews and our chairs. What do you think that's about?
Reverend Jude, thank you so much. This season has been, I feel, pretty dense on the theoretical topics. Going through these values, I've learned so much about how we do moral and ethic conversations, especially when context is so important. We're trying to live these values out in congregations. We're trying to live these values out in real relationships. It's been complicated. What does love actually look like? Well, it seems to look pretty complicated. I absolutely agree with your observation that love can sound a little touchy-feely and flowery. Where then does the rubber hit the road? When we work on these values, when we talk about these values, I think it can feel a little dissociated. And love in particular kind of lacks some of the teeth, I think, that we expect a moral and social ethic to bring to us. You mentioned we both have our own ideas of what love means, and my idea of love is actually that it does contain plenty of those teeth. My understanding of love is that it isn't flowery or touchy-feely, but that actually the effort of love involves love of self and love of these values. These conflicts are not so easy to reconcile, particularly when we are in conflict with others or with ourselves. I think that our current national moment is an example of that. It is not simple or clear how we perform these values in a divisive context when we are not only critical of how we got here, but of the other people participating in our shared national enterprise. As we're getting ready to invite a deeply conservative regime into our country, how do we hold progressive values? How do we value ourselves as progressives, respect and love those who believe or feel differently, and do that in mutually constructive ways? It's complicated.
I found the shift over the pandemic period in Unitarian Universalist spaces to be moving steadily, maybe slowly, but it feels steadily in most of the spaces I've been, toward taking love seriously in the way you're saying, that it does have teeth. I think about my parents' love. There's sometimes love meant setting boundaries, right? And that was better for me. And I think about my relationship as an adult to my parents. And sometimes it's me as the kid setting boundaries when I still love them and I'm still going to help them. But there's a point sometimes where you have to say that this is not going to work for us. And I think about the really serious stuff that we're going to be facing, and we're already facing, that's impacting our trans and non-binary folks in our country, and our migrants and our immigrants. That there's a lot of behavior we're going to be seeing that is going to be anti-pluralistic, that's going to be anti-equity, that is going to seem to us so skewed justice wise. And you mentioned disassociation. I think, especially with being informed by all the trauma impacting all of us and all the adjacency we are to all the horrors, even if it's not hitting us, it's hitting someone we know, or we have friends right now in Southern California where neighborhoods are gone, and we're going to look at a world that's going to continue to ignore science, which is something that in our tradition we value. And more of these horrors are going to happen.
Mm.
Love might be the only response in the short term, in the immediate.
Mm. These are really powerful observations, Reverend Jude, and I love thinking about the ways that love doesn't have to look gentle and kind. It can still be loving. When I hear that, the first thing that comes up for me is this relationship that came up earlier this season and also in season 2 between forgiveness and accountability. It's not enough simply to forgive someone if that person has no accountability for the meaning of their behavior. That forgiveness becomes a way of placating and ignoring the problem rather than addressing the problem and allowing yourself to heal and the transgressor to heal through self-knowledge. I think that accountability is an important piece of forgiveness in the same way that some of these values are a requirement for love. You know, Reverend Jude, you were talking specifically about how, for example, if a social issue doesn't directly impact us, if a tragedy doesn't directly impact us, it still impacts us through our relationships and through the very real presence of our interdependence. It is one thing to value interdependence and recognize that we are in this together, so to speak. And yet, there is also an expectation that interdependence is simply true. What does happen to someone else will have an impact,
Right.
whether we value it or not.
Right. It's not a belief, it's a value, it's a reality. We are interdependent.
Exactly.
And we're not going to see a lot of accountability in the political circles of our leadership. I doubt it. But I think that all of us trying to find grounding in our values during this is helpful to remind us of what is actually normal, what is actually real, because we're going to be told a lot of things that are not real. This week in particular, because we're talking right before the inauguration, I'm reminded to the speculative fiction she called herself, although a lot of folks would call Octavia Butler a science fiction author. She's won awards in that category, but she would call herself speculative fiction. And she would write in the 90s about a time when Southern California was on fire. We had a charlatan who faked being religious, being in the presidency. And I say fake being religious. He claimed to be part of a church in Manhattan who, at the time, one of their pastors was my teaching assistant for Bible study in a Christian seminary, who said he had never come to that church. A charlatan who's now bringing up drama with Canada. And that was in the book. The book was we had a war with our northern neighbor. And I mention it because our speculative fiction writers, our authors who are looking to the future, are warning us. They're getting a glimpse somehow of something that might happen, and we're watching it actually happen. And the message in those stories is it is not going to be easy. It's not going to be pretty. It's going to be horrible. And everything we do changes the world. And everything that we change changes us. And we remember that, and then we ground ourselves back into our values to know what's right and wrong.
That's so powerful, Reverend Jude. Everything we touch changes us. What was the rest of that?
The Fuller quote is, everything we touch, we change. Everything we change changes us. The only constant is change. God is change.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. You know, at first I'm thinking about love and what love looks like. Sometimes telling the truth is what love looks like, and telling the truth when, just as you said, entire institutions, civic institutions, refuse their own accountability. Sometimes telling the truth is a difficult practice and a difficult process. I'm thinking about how we ground ourselves in these values, and good art consistently reminds me of the value of human concern, of the value of struggle. On my mind for some time, for several months, has been a particular quote by Toni Morrison. She was responding to the inauguration of George Bush, which was a traumatizing time 20 years ago or so. The quote is that this is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. And I think that that is a clear assessment of what is needed in our time. Civilizations need to heal, not simply our civilization. And I can certainly say from a historical lens that civilizations past needed healing and didn't find it. So I think now, when we consider what love looks like, I'm leaning more towards justice and less towards generosity. I think justice has love at its center in a way that is very visceral for us, particularly in trying political times. These values are context independent. I think we can hold these values during peace as easily as we hold them during conflict. But it's hard for me not to view love in terms of the conflict we are experiencing in this country right now.
And it's that tension between accountability and justice is a thread that's moving through Unitarian Universalist circles the last several years. Accountability for some is a scary word or a bad word, or what are you going to do to me? And I look to all of my fellow QUs who have an issue with that word. We're looking in our nation right now with an abject, extreme lack of any sense of accountability. And look at how horrible that is. And then on the ground in our own congregations, accountability can help us just course correct. We're not talking about the worst in the world. We're talking about small mistakes or sometimes bigger mistakes. We all mess up. And if we're grounding all of that in love, at the extreme that we can see it in the global spheres, accountability reminds us that things have to stop at some point.
That's so powerful. I'm thinking right now about the ways that our value of transformation can actually lift up our power to be accountable. If we truly trust and love ourselves, if we value transformation, that is to say, we recognize our capacity to grow in wisdom, to grow in spiritual depth and strength, then it should not be so scary to become accountable for our mistakes, for our words. The value of transformation, in my opinion, is a healthy antidote to nostalgia. We may think things were good, but valuing transformation insists that things must always be better.
And they always change.
Yes.
We talked about this I think it was a sermon I gave recently where we were lamenting all the thousand things of the world that were going horrible. And it's really easy in that to fixate on how bad things are now and feel like we've fallen so far. But, you go back to the 50s in the States, and that wasn't a better time. We did not have equal access. Not all women could vote yet. Not all people of color could vote. And that's not better. And then going back to any generation before that in the US was worse for most people. So not to downplay it, because we are going to be facing what we're facing, and some of us may not live through this. That's how dangerous this is. And yet we still need to strive toward transformation and justice centered in love and not despair. Because our ancestors dealt with worse things since the dawn of time. This is what we do as humans. Every generation needs to learn and relearn the ethical lessons of the prior generation. And for us, we've got a rubric in our values on how to return to them to make sure we are living into right behavior.
There's a young man that I speak with some regularity, a young man of color, who was sharing with me just how many of his friends in New York City, he's from New York City, have passed away. And as he was recounting the individuals, friends, colleagues, even acquaintances his age that are no longer with us, it occurred to him that there were several dozen young men of color in his similar circumstance that didn't survive the last 2 decades. I think it's important to lean into the reality that there are many of us who will not survive this coming onslaught, cultural onslaught. An onslaught that, if you have any connection to the language of Project 2025, and if you don't, I encourage you to read it, language that is explicitly incendiary and demonizing, language that is violent, and language that is very clearly not rooted in love or the values of pluralism and equity. I think for me, as a Black man whose ancestors dealt with incontrovertibly more difficult circumstances, much worse circumstances, it's easy for me to see some of my responsibility simply to survive. I owe it to my ancestors to take my life seriously because they did. They took the presence of future generations seriously. And so I feel that for me, simply surviving is a way of loving those ancestors. It's a way of loving those who came before, who felt it so important that I survive. And now I'm thinking about what our opportunities are in this context. And I think that valuing humankind, valuing one another, recognizing that in the value of equity is an appreciation for the life of every individual. I think that gives us a little bit more of an opportunity to push ourselves into the future without things having to be perfect. This is a bit of a tangent, but I just started watching on Netflix this mini series called American Primeval. It is set in the American West during pioneer times, and the context is a growing war between Brigham Young's militia, a coalition of Mormons, and the United States government. In this context is an already existing tension between the Shoshone communities in the area and the Ute and Paiute communities that have a sort of a large swath of territory and interact in different ways. And so I'm thinking about that particular context where violence, racism, fear, misinformation, accusations were the rule. And thinking about how that has become our rule again can certainly be terrifying if we don't lean into our value of transformation. What has happened in the past, I don't think can happen in the future. Something is different. Something will be different, even if it's just the presence of us, we who take these values seriously and who want so desperately to live into a new world. One of the values, for example, in justice is working to be diverse, beloved communities. What a powerful value. If we hold that value and lean into it with our behavior, I think there's no telling what sort of world we can create.
I really appreciate that framing for hope, because I want to end us on a message of hope in these values. I'm remembering I used to serve a congregation on Long Island, and all the congregations out there, the 11 of us would team together, and for 30 or 40 years, it's still going on. FA's summer youth camp, and usually it'd be about 85 to 100 children and youth from like 3rd grade to 11th grade. And it was deeply, powerfully meaningful to those children and teens. You would hear them talk about it as they graduated. For those that were bridging in our graduating services, in worship, would always talk about it. And something that was powerful and hopeful for me, it was a beautiful, and as a queer man, I would say genuinely safe space for queer and trans and non-binary and gay and lesbian and bi youth to come out and to figure out who they are. And as a queer man who didn't grow up with that, being able to be a role model for healthy leadership as a queer person kept me going in hard times. I think it's remembering our relationship to our ancestors and remembering our relationship to those that come after us, and remembering how that ourselves, we want to be, hopefully, as we age, future good ancestors. And these values that we have are that roadmap. If we center it in love and we're not stunted by hope, but we allow it to energize ourselves, that's a good place to be.
I couldn't agree more. As a Catholic, there aren't always clear invitations to share some of my sort of more Catholic beliefs or ideas. But part of why I agree so much with you, Reverend Jude, is because I also personally believe that this life is not the end of our existence, and our opportunities to build don't simply end with this life. We'll have opportunities in a life to come to do those things as well. So who are we going to become? We can become that now, and even if we don't get there, we will have begun the process.
Amen. It's been a great season. Thank you for joining us for Roots to Leaves as we close out our third season this year, focusing on our shared values. And we're glad to be able to team up with Wellspring's more intensive programming. This is Reverend Jude Geiger from Community Church, signing out.
I just also want to send a special thank you to Dr. Yvonne Garrett, who joined us through most of this season and whose time as a student minister didn't include this episode. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us. And thank you to all of our guests who've been with us.
Be well.
Be well.